Hello and welcome to Time Trek. I'm your host, Peter Connor, and in today's video we're going to be breaking down a few historical and archaeological terms that you may have heard of, you may be a little bit confused about. You might have read an article about a Mesolithic discovery or a Palaeolithic hoard that's been recently dug up, or a Bronze Age civilization in the Near East that's been discovered, and you may be a little bit confused as to what all these terms mean, where's it come from. So hopefully today that's what we're going to be discussing and hopefully enlightening you a little bit about. So the terms themselves, Stone Age, Bronze Age and Iron Age, they first were used and the terms were coined by Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, a very Danish man that lived in the 1800s, and he noticed in his museum that there was the artifacts that he was in his museum corresponded quite neatly to the finding a lot of Stone Age artifacts, Bronze Age artifacts, and then he'd find Iron Age artifacts. And obviously this would also correspond to the layers of soil, so the deeper he'd go, they obviously, when there was excavating these sites, they'd find Stone Age artifacts deeper in the ground, and then obviously the Iron Age artifacts would be found higher in the ground. So today we're going to be breaking down these terms one by one, but one of the first and probably most important things to note about the use of these terms is that it's not uniform. It's not all of the world suddenly developed bronze in the year 10,000 BC and the day after 10,000 BC everyone was using bronze. No, it was very isolated. Some areas of the world were in the Bronze Age whilst other areas of the world were still in the Stone Age. For example, when the Great Pyramids were being built in Egypt, that was in the middle of the Egyptian Bronze Age, but at the exact same time Stonehenge was being built, and obviously that was in the end of the Stone Age for Stone Age Britain. So it's just something to note that it's not a uniform thing where all of a sudden everyone started using bronze and then all of a sudden everyone started using iron, because it was not like that. So let's begin at the beginning. So the Stone Age. The Stone Age is vast period of time. It covers from around 3.4 million years ago to around 5,000, 6,000 years ago when we started using bronze. So it's such a vast period of time. We're talking 3 million years. In terms of the beginning of the Stone Age, we're talking about the beginning in Ethiopia in Africa, where we can see the first earliest evidence of stone tools being used. Obviously these were being used by people that weren't humans, but human-like people, so probably Homo erectus or Homo australopithecus perhaps, or Homo ergaster. There's quite a few candidates. It could have been around that time, but we're talking about the first time that these creatures, we'll just call them humans for the sake of it, but these first time these human beings, they created stone tools, and they use these stone tools to manipulate and control their environment. In terms of the common stone tools that we see, great book by the way, one of my all-time favorite books. Everyone should read this book, History of the World in 100 Objects. But we can see at the start of this book what kind of stone tools human beings or humans were making at the beginning of human evolution about 3.4 million years ago. We can see these were big stone tools, but these were multi-purpose tools as well. So these were tools that were used for everything. It was the Swiss Army knife equivalent of its day. So as I say, the Stone Age is such a vast period of time that it gets broken down into 3 sections because it's over 3 million years, and obviously it needs to be further subdivided. So archaeologists actually divide the Stone Age into 3 distinct sections. They call the first, and the one we've just been talking about, the Palaeolithic, which literally just means the old Stone Age. It comes from the Greek because obviously 18th and 19th century scholars, they loved the Latin and Greek, so that's why we have Latin and Greek in everything now. But yeah, Paleolithic, it literally just means the old Stone Age. So that's what we're going to be talking about first. So yeah, as I said, the main tools were these hand axe tools, and these which were very multi-purpose, and we see them evidenced everywhere, as I said, by even beginning in Africa about 3.4 million years ago, but by 2 million years ago we could see them in China, and we could also see them in Europe and other parts of the world being spread and used by these early hominins. So during the Paleolithic age, hominins grouped together in small societies, small bands of people, and they subsisted by gathering plants, fishing and hunting, or by scavenging wild animals. Most people think the Paleolithic age was very heavily meat based, just from general ideas about cavemen and what cavemen were doing, but it's probably a lot more plant-based diet than you actually would think. Lots of nuts as well, and berries, and basically whatever they could scavenge from the environment and from the earth, they'd eat it. If they could eat it and it solved the hunger issue, they didn't really care if it was a scavenged corpse they'd found or if it was a woolly mammoth they'd hunted. So yeah, that categorizes the Paleolithic age, as I said, the first age of the Stone Age. Now the Paleolithic age, it lasted from around 3.4 million years ago till around 50,000 years ago. So that is a space of about 3 million years. So obviously the archaeologists have to subdivide that even further and create even more confusion. But the Paleolithic is subdivided even further into the upper, middle and lower. So obviously the lower Paleolithic is the furthest back. It's called the lower Paleolithic because you literally have to dig lower in the ground to get to it because it's further back in time. The middle Paleolithic is you have to dig and then is in the middle, and then obviously the upper Paleolithic is called the upper Paleolithic because it's at the top. And it's a bit closer to the ground, a bit closer to modern day. So that was the Paleolithic, which brings us on to the Mesolithic, which is just the Middle Stone Age. Literally just means the Middle Stone Age from the Greek. So in this point we're talking about the Middle Stone Age, and what makes the Middle Stone Age more distinct, different from the Paleolithic. Well, in the Mesolithic Stone Age, which began around 50,000 years ago to around 10,000 years ago, the types of cultures associated with the Mesolithic, it varies often between areas. Each area is is a bit different, but the main characteristic is that there is a decline in hunting of large animals and large game. So there's a big decline in the hunting of, like, say, woolly mammoths is the classic stereotypical example, and more of a hunting of smaller game, so like deers or aurochs or other types of smaller game that would have been hunted in smaller groups of people. So yeah, the decline in hunting of large game in favour of broader hunter-gatherer way of life, a much more broader specialisation of individual groups. So say one men might go off to hunt deer, the other men might go off to hunt aurochs, and then a group of women might go off and gather some water. Another group of women might go off and gather some berries, and then when everyone comes together at the end of the day, even if some of the people failed in their tasks, they'd usually have something to eat and something to carry on until the next day. So much more specialisation and a different social dynamic, but we can see distinctly the Mesolithic period because we can see there's a big difference in the types of stone tools they use. There's a much more variety of stone tools, much more specialist stone tools. So for example, we see harpoons, spears, bows and arrows being invented during the Mesolithic period. So these are smaller stone tools, but more specialized stone tools that we see in the Mesolithic period. It's important to note that although this is all classified as the Stone Age, these peoples would have been using wood, bones, as well as plant materials, but these just haven't survived the archaeological record as well as stone does. So yeah, that's the Mesolithic period. Which brings me on to the final period of the Stone Age, which is called the Neolithic period. Neo, which literally means new, and lithic, which means Stone Age, so the New Stone Age. The New Stone Age is probably the single most important period in human history. It's the moment which completely transformed human history. If it wasn't for the Neolithic revolution and the Neolithic age, everything would be different. We'd still be hunter-gatherers. There'd still only be around 10 to 20 million people on the whole planet. The Neolithic period is the single most important period in human history for one thing and one thing only that happens during the Neolithic period, and that is the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution was a term coined by V. Gordon Childe, an Australian dude from the 1930s, and it just simply means the moment we started agriculture and farming. You might know it as the Agricultural Revolution, but as I say, it's mostly referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. So whenever that term comes up in a textbook or a history book, the Neolithic Revolution is just the moment and that period in which we switched from hunting and gathering our food to agriculture. We can see in the Neolithic period that societies all around the world began to independently turn away from this hunter-gatherer way of life and slowly turn towards farming as another way of life. Although farming began, and we can see it began around Turkey and the modern day Middle East, Iraq and Syria. It began there, but it also began independently in many other areas around the world, notably China, around the same time, not long after, and in the Americas as well. But what you've got to remember is each area that have had their own plants and animals that they would have been domesticating. So obviously in China, their staple crop would have probably been rice. In America, it was corn. Whereas in the Near East and Europe, it became barley and wheat, which obviously we got lovely bread from. So that's nice. So as human beings begin to switch to farming in the Neolithic Revolution, we can see many things beginning to happen, such as the very first towns and cities. So there's sites such as Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük, both located in Turkey. Göbekli Tepe is an ancient ritual site, probably a religious site, where ancient Neolithic peoples would have gone to worship. But in Çatalhöyük, we have evidence of the first town type place. Probably a bit early to call it a city, because this is a town of about 3,000 to 8,000 people living together. But this is the first time we see numbers anywhere near that size of people living together in one place at one time. We don't see any evidence in Çatalhöyük of a hierarchy, so we don't see any evidence of a king or any upper class or elite. In fact, all the houses are all very similar. There's no larger house where the king lived. In fact, if you look at pictures of Çatalhöyük, you'll see it looks they were all interconnected houses, and the peoples would have actually walked along the roofs of the houses to get to their house, and they didn't have a front door. Everyone actually came in through the roof hatch. We see some very interesting things around death and funerary rites at this time. So we see in Çatalhöyük, they buried their dead under the floorboards, essentially. So there'd have been up to 60-70 skeletons underneath your house that you lived in Çatalhöyük. So yeah, Stonehenge is a classic example of Neolithic structures. So if you want to picture Stonehenge, but that's the kind of things that people were building. If you look at Catalhoyuk and Göbekli Tepe, them just kind of big stone structures as well. That's kind of indicative of what Neolithic people were doing at the time. The Neolithic age is probably the most important age to get your head around, and as I say, that is that moment. Around 10,000 years ago, it began in Turkey and the Near East, farming and agriculture, and it's the moment which completely transformed our lives. And this brings me on to the Bronze Age. Now, the Bronze Age, it began in the Near East around 3300 BCE, so around 5,300 years ago, and it was characterized by obviously the use of bronze. Now we do begin to see some larger civilizations in the Bronze Age, so we go from Catalhoyuk, where we see a population of around 3,000 to 8,000, to the first proper cities where we're seeing tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people living in one place at one time. We see the beginnings of these early civilizations that you may have heard of, like ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Minoan civilization, and the Hittite civilization. As I said, towards the end of the Stone Age, in the Neolithic age, we see the very, very first evidence of writing, but writing doesn't really become a massive, ubiquitous thing till the Bronze Age. And writing began in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, as a way to catalogue all the goats and grain and all the farming stuff that was being exchanged from one hand to the other. So it was just basically a way of writing down and making sure that everything checked out. And that was the origin of writing. But once writing began, it obviously spread to other civilizations. But bronze itself, you might hear a term come up before the Bronze Age, which was known as the Copper Age. Now the Copper Age isn't seen, is basically a couple of hundred years before the Bronze Age, but that's when copper is a very, very ubiquitous metal that you can find pretty much all over the world, but it's quite useless in terms of doing stuff with it. But when copper was smelted with tin, you got bronze, and you got a very, very useful metal alloy, because it's made from smelting two metals together. The problem though with making bronze is that tin was exceptionally hard to find. Tin only existed in a very few locations, and if it didn't exist in abundance even in those locations, it's, you know, almost as rare as gold on the Earth's core. So it set up huge trading networks where these ancient civilizations could get tin. So for example, ancient Egypt, they didn't have a very good supply of tin, so they would have been trading for bronze, but they would have been trading some of their goods that they had for bronze. The Bronze Age is characterized by the use of bronze, the use of writing, and other features of early urban civilization. So the Bronze Age is just characterized by that, the very, very beginnings of cities, the widespread use of writing in these civilizations, so the Hittites, the Chinese civilization, and all these early pre-civilizations that would have had writing, had access to bronze or the trading networks so they could make bronze, and then were using this to make the very first cities, the very first societies, where, you know, there would have been one person that would have been the bronze smith, so like the metal worker, but the guy who was working with the metal, he wouldn't have been out on the agriculture, gathering the grain in the field that he needed to sustain him and his family. It would have been an integrated system where obviously he would have traded his metal works for some grain or some other types of food. So it was a very interconnected system, and a more specialized system where certain groups of individuals are getting more specialized tasks. We also see the beginnings of a hierarchy of human beings. So if we see the first kings, the first emperors, the first, as I say, strongmen, who would have been the who would have owned the larger properties and, you know, had and lived more luxurious lives than perhaps the other people would have been. In terms of the ages, the Bronze Age is the smallest, and the Bronze Age is kind of the most unusual and the most unique. For example, a lot of cultures, they don't even have a Bronze Age. So sub-Saharan Africa, they actually skip the Bronze Age, though they don't have a Bronze Age. And other cultures around the world, because of the inaccessibility of tin, that's another reason they don't have a Bronze Age. So the Bronze Age was the beginnings of civilization, and we see the beginnings of these trading networks that span the whole world. We see the beginnings of the Silk Road connecting China to Europe. But as I say, they were mainly it's called the Silk Road because of what was later traded on it thousands of years later, but at this time it would have been mainly metals that were being traded along the Silk Road. But what the point is that all these civilizations were very interconnected into one another. So yeah, the Bronze Age is basically, you can think of it as the beginnings of civilization, the beginnings of these large urban cities, the beginnings of social hierarchies, the beginnings of armies, the first peace treaties between civilizations we see. So yeah, think of it as this very early, very beginnings of civilization. And then it all ended. Then it all came to a climactic ending, and in the probably the weirdest, strangest period of human history, the Bronze Age collapse. It's a period when we see the end of all these classical civilizations. So we see the end of the Hittites, we see the Ugaritic kingdom completely destroyed, the Minoans get destroyed, ancient Greece goes into a dark age, and all of civilization collapses. The only real ancient civilization that survives is ancient Egypt, but ancient Egypt is probably on a decline ever since this point, and that's because of the Bronze Age collapse. Basically, what happened, all these civilizations that were very, very interconnected, they all collapsed one by one, and it led to a huge civilization collapse around the year 1200 BC. So this is about 3,000 years ago. Many reasons get thrown out as to why all these civilizations collapsed within the blink of an eye in historical terms. There's often mentioning to these peoples called the Sea Peoples that just come out of the sea and destroy all these civilizations. But that's going to be a topic for another day. But the Bronze Age collapse is an important point to note because it ends the Bronze Age and it brings us on to the next age. Final age that we're going to be discussing, the Iron Age. Now, the Iron Age, iron has been worked by mankind for thousands of years. The metal iron ores we get from meteorites have been used and manipulated by people for thousands of years. But the actual Iron Age, it began just after the Bronze Age collapse. So, as I say, all these ancient civilizations, they began to collapse, and then the Iron Age comes along. So bronze, obviously, as I said, relied on that interconnected network of trading from one place to the other. So tin that we needed to get from Cornwall or tin from Afghanistan required that huge interconnected trading network. Well, iron don't need that at all. Iron, you can find it pretty much anywhere. Iron is one of the most commonly found metals on Earth. It can be found anywhere, and it still has to be, excavated, dug up and mined, but you don't need that complicated trading network to find the rare metal. But one difference about iron to bronze is that although it's very, very common, you can find it everywhere, you do have to smelt it at very, very, very high temperatures. So with bronze, you could smelt bronze just over a regular open fire because it requires temperatures of about 500, 600 degrees, which is about the average of what an average fire can get to. Whereas with iron, you need temperatures above 1500 degrees Celsius. So that is incredibly hot, obviously, but It requires the use of a furnace and much more control of heat by these early Iron Age man. So we know that these first Iron Age peoples, they had use of furnaces and they could manipulate heat in such a way as to create these iron objects that they were making. So we see the Iron Age, it began, as I say, when the Bronze Age collapsed around that time, so around 1200 BCE, 3200 years ago. But one important thing to note about the Iron Age when it began, iron was actually worse than bronze. It wasn't as strong as bronze when it was just wrought in its pure form. It wasn't until they started experimenting a little bit with carbon impurities and other impurities to mix together with the iron to create a more steel-like structure, which created a much stronger and lighter metal than bronze. So once you've got that steel-like structure, that's what you want to go with, because it's stronger and it's lighter than bronze, so it's better than bronze. So if you look at a Roman sword, that would have been made of that steel-like structure with a little bit of carbon impurities in the iron, and that's what a Roman sword would have been made of. The Iron Age is characterized by a huge transformation in society and in the way people lived and in the way people interacted in their environment. New tools, because of what iron allowed them to do, the strength of iron, created much more specialized tools for certain jobs, for are improving and helping other jobs. So for example, the scythe was invented for cutting down crops and agriculture, which actually allowed these peoples to create food much more easily, create a much higher production of food, and therefore have access and produce this food much easier than when they had to make it in the Bronze Age. So we see in early Europe, in the early Iron Age, we have people like the Hallstatt culture who had a series of longhouses, and that was kind of their central little hub. And the longhouse model would be they'd spread all over Central Europe, and we can see their longhouses when we dig up in the archaeological record. So in terms of classification about the Iron Age and when it ended, well, a lot of archaeologists will tell you that the Iron Age ended around when the Roman Empire started, but in technological terms we were still in the Iron Age up until the Industrial Revolution. We could call the Roman Empire an Iron Age people, we could call the Vikings an Iron Age people, because that's the technology they were using. What you've got to remember as well about each age as it progresses, it's not like when we got to the Iron Age then everyone just abandons bronze. Bronze gets abandoned for certain things, but bronze was still in use for other things. So bronze might have still been in use for jewelry, or it might still been in use for shields, but it wasn't still in use for other things. So yeah, the Iron Age is a period in which people move away from the Bronze Age civilizations, and it's a much more ubiquitous metal that can be found anywhere, so you don't have to have these big trading networks. So it allows for much more specialist, smaller groups of farmers to create and set up their own way of life. And think of the Iron Age as having a lot of the tools and a lot of the objects that we'd have in our modern world. It's it's not too dissimilar to our modern world in that sense. Which finally brings me on to some of the issues and problems that we have when we use this three-age system. So the first and probably most common problem with the three-age system is that it's Eurocentric. It's a Eurocentric model. This was probably because the Thomson, who invented the three-age model, he was Danish, and the objects he was looking at were very Northern European. And obviously when he was classifying the three-age system, it was 200 years ago, and he obviously had access to a lot less stuff than we have today. The three-age model, it fits very well into Northern Europe, and we can see very distinct time periods, and it models and tracks very well to Northern Europe and a few other places around the world, but it doesn't track everywhere and it doesn't work out everywhere around the world. So for example, in North America and in Australia, those two places, they never had a Bronze Age. They never discovered bronze or had a metal age like we had in other places around the world. Which kind of brings us on to another point, an issue with the three-age system. Some people would say, well, then we look down on people from North America, them early Native American peoples, and we should look down on the Australian peoples because they were less advanced. They didn't get into the Bronze Age, and therefore, etc. They didn't go in the stage system. But to think of the three-age system as like a progression towards advancement and towards modernity and towards an improvement, it is the wrong way to look at it. For one, was the life of the Native American before the Europeans showed up, was that Native American more happier then, or were they more happier in their way of life after they got introduced to iron and metallurgy? Well, most Native American peoples, even today, would say they were much happier before the Europeans showed up. And that's kind of a way to think about this three-age system. It's not a progression towards advancement. It's just kind of the way that human beings adapted to their lives and their environment and the things that they had at their disposal to improve their lives and make their lives better. But as I said, once we switched to farming was harder to sustain. It produced less calories. We actually shrank in size. Our bones weren't as strong. Our brain cavities actually shrank during the Neolithic revolution. So these things aren't always an advancement towards improvement and in towards, it doesn't work like that. You can't look on one group of people and say that they were backwards because they didn't leave the Stone Age. And then another reason that the three-age model, it comes into a lot of problems, is because in sub-Saharan Africa, they didn't have a Bronze Age, but they just skipped straight to the Iron Age. So the three-age model doesn't really fit in sub-Saharan Africa. And there are other cultures around the world where we can see they kind of skip the Bronze Age. So this is another reason as to why the three-age model doesn't fit completely in the modern world. But it's terms that you see crop up a lot, especially in journalism, in newspapers, in articles that are meant for the general public. You'll often see the word Bronze Age or Iron Age find, etc. This was just a video, so I hope you're a little bit more aware of what these terms mean. Hopefully explain and enlighten a little bit more about what them terms mean, where they come from, why we use them, and some of the possible issues and troubles that we can have in using them. But in terms of a system that helps you picture what the way of life were for them people, and the technological abilities that these people had, that is kind of the reason for the system, and that's kind of probably why it still prevailed even to this day, even though modern archaeologists are backing away from the three-age system. So yeah, that'll about do it for today. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a little bit of something about these terms. And until the next video, I'll see you next time. Please give us a like, maybe subscribe. That always helps, apparently, I'm told. So yeah, if you could give us a like, subscribe, that would be amazing. But until then, I'll just say thank you so much for watching. And until next time, I'll see you on the next video. Goodbye.